As most viewers to this Digital Policy Institute webinar already know, the 1992 Cable Act created, among other things, the concept of retransmission consent. It deals with cable TV and satellite carriage of terrestrial, local, commercial TV stations. Under this still current law, every 3 years, commercial TV stations are given the choice of obtaining traditional must-carry of their signals on multi-channel video providers, or opting for the retransmission consent approach, where carriage of that station's signal only can happen if there's an agreement between the station and the MVPD. Congress enacted the retransmission consent option for a variety of reasons, including to help ensure continued and robust local service by TV stations licensed to provide that service to their local communities, and also because of the perceived insufficiencies of the 1976 Copyright Act to have MVPDs compensate broadcasters fairly for their use of the broadcast programs they were delivering to their subscribers. Now it's 25 years later, and we've seen a significant escalation in retrans fees, as well as network affiliation agreements, now tending to shift much of those retransmission consent dollars from local TV stations to the programming networks with which they're affiliated. Many TV markets, as we all know, have experienced those highly publicized games of chicken and viewer angst where local stations and MVPDs could not reach prompt agreement, sometimes leading to lengthy station blackouts. An FCC rulemaking proceeding aimed at changing the rules governing disputes and blackouts was terminated by the Commission last year with no action. In the meantime, bills on Capitol Hill have proposed a variety of changes to retransmission consent statutory law and new options for parties' negotiations on station carriage. I'm Barry Umansky. I'm Senior Fellow and Senior Policy Advisor of the Digital Policy Institute. Created back in 2004, our institute has produced a steady stream of research and policy papers, conferences, and webinars that have covered a wide range of legal, economic, and policy issues. To learn more about DPI, go to digitalpolicyinstitute.org. The matters we're talking about today are highly complicated and very controversial, but we have a truly outstanding panel to explain the issues and arguments and predict the likely future for retransmission consent. I'm at the DPI studios in Indiana, and we have 3 panelists that will be joining us shortly, one in Monterey, California, and the other 2 in Washington, D.C. You'll find their full biographies on the DPI website. Justin Nielsen is Senior Research Analyst for Broadcast Media at Kagan S&P Global Market Intelligence in Monterey. Focusing on broadcast and new media, he's a regular contributor to Kagan's broadcast and internet media investor newsletters, as well as the S&P Global Media and Communications online database. His work also has been found in a variety of Kagan's desk books and white papers, including those on radio and TV station deals, the economics of retransmission consent, the future of 4K and internet television. Justin's analyses frequently are quoted in trade publications as well as in national media such as Bloomberg, CNBC, Forbes, NPR, Reuters, and the New York Times. In Washington, D.C., we have Ryan Radia. He's a Senior Research Fellow and Regulatory Counsel at the Competitive Enterprise Institute in Washington. His work there focuses on adapting law and public policy to the unique challenges of the information age. His research areas include intellectual property, information privacy, cybersecurity, media regulation, and competition policy, with his work often cited in scholarly journals. Ryan has published articles in major news outlets such as Forbes, Ad Age, Investors Business Daily, and Ars Technica. He's also been quoted in publications including the Los Angeles Times, the New Republic, Time Magazine, and Fortune. Ryan appears regularly on TV and radio programs, including Marketplace on NPR and Cavuto on Fox Business. Larry Spywak is a frequent panelist on DPI webinars. He's president of the Phoenix Center for Advanced Legal and Policy Public Public Policy Studies in Washington. Each year, the Phoenix Center tackles a wide range of public policy issues involving the law and economics of the digital age. Larry is a prolific author and scholar whose academic work is cited frequently by policymakers, major news media, and academic journals around the world. Prior to joining the Phoenix Center, he was senior attorney with the competition division of the FCC's Office of the General Counsel. He currently co-chairs the Federal Communications Bar Association's committee overseeing its law journal. In fact, that Communications Bar conferred its Distinguished Service Award, its highest honor, to Larry 6 years ago. Again, full biographies of today's panelists are found on our DPI website. So let's get to work. Justin Nielsen in Monterey. When they say it's not about the money, it's usually about the money. Justin, what's the future outlook?
Oh, yeah.
Exactly. What's the future for TV station revenues in a highly competitive market, and what's the relationship to those revenues to our subject at hand, retransmission consent? Justin.
Thanks, Barry. Yes, you hit it right on the nose. I mean, it all comes down to the economics of TV stations, and it has changed dramatically over the past 10 years. Back in 2007, actually, most of the TV station revenue pie was from advertising, either on the local, national level, and political, with only about 2% coming from retrans consent. Now, that has shifted dramatically over the past 10 years, and now it's approaching 30% of total TV revenues in the last year. So, and we actually expect it to grow even further over the next, 5 to 6 years, up to about 35%. Now, there's definitely some shifts in terms of advertising, with new digital players and social media platforms taking some share away from TV stations. But the ability for TV stations to negotiate higher rates in every renewal period with the multi-channel operators has enabled them to, gain scale, as well as, compete for programming not only on the network level, but also on the local level.
Larry Spywak, in response to what Justin just said, everyone knows that retransmission consent rates have increased in some cases rather dramatically. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And what is at the root of that change? Larry Spywak.
Well, good or bad is for the market to decide. I think there's two reasons. I mean, number one, the cost of programming goes up, and broadcasters provide programming that, at least for right now, people want to watch. So, and those costs tend to be passed through directly to the programmers, as you guys mentioned. So, as there's no government regulation on how much Hollywood decides to spend on desirable programming, and people want to watch it, and not only that, on top of sports programming, rates generally are going to go up. But the real issue is in terms of the bargaining power. And what's interesting is that when retrans first came out in the 90s, you had essentially a bilateral monopoly. You had one buyer, which was the MVPD, and one seller, which was the broadcaster. And now what's interesting is that as distribution has become highly competitive, you've had a shift of the bargaining position where the broadcaster has the ability to say, well, at some point, if it was just one buyer, one seller, you had a sort of mutually assured destruction. Either the signal gets carried or it doesn't. And now if one MVPD decides I don't want it, there are several other in the market, and broadcasters are able to successfully play off. So you do have a bit of an asymmetry of bargaining power that shifted over the last couple of years, which has probably contributed to it.
Brian Radia, if the Congress or the FCC takes some action that might result in a reduction in retransmission consent rates, what would that do in terms of the public interest and what we see on television? Ryan.
So I agree with Larry that the question of how high or low retransmission fees should be, or to boil it down, the question of how much programmers should be charging MVPDs is one that should be left to the market. But if Congress or the FCC were to act in a way intended to bring these fees down, the result, I think, would be first, that programmers, the networks and the studios from which they buy programming would spend less on it. As Larry mentioned, that's a big driver of these costs. But another possibility is that we would see the major networks essentially become cable channels, and that's a possibility that's been discussed One of the top executives at Fox has floated that, I think, on several occasions. I don't see that happening in the short run under current law, but if the retransmission regime is substantially affected by regulation or legislation, while the other side, the pay TV channels, are still subject to pricing freedom, the possibility is that networks essentially end their relationships with local broadcasting stations, which in turn is probably bad news for local broadcasting stations whose viewership is largely a function of the programming that they get from the networks.
Yeah. Well, going back to Justin Nielsen in California, what's your reaction to what Ryan said? You on point? You have a different view, the same view? Justin?
Yes, I would agree with the point that if there's more regulation on the TV stations, you may see a shift in programming, from the network side. But also they deliver a lot of local content that is valuable to the networks as well. A lot of that distribution that's happening, outside of the multi-channel universe is going through over-the-top types of services like Hulu Live, Sony View, and Sling TV. And they see that even though the network programming is some of the most popular content for customers, the actual local content is still very valuable, with local news and programming kind of pulling together that audience in the local markets. And that's something that the cable networks don't currently provide.
Yeah, that's a good point. Certainly broadcast localism, the notion of local programming, going to local audiences, that really has been the lion's share of the effort of local broadcasters as opposed to really anybody else, and it's certainly something to be valued. Going back to Ryan Radia, I didn't get into this too much in the setup, but could you explain the differences between retransmission consent and copyright ownership?
So all of these works, whether it's a local news program or the television shows on network TV or an NFL game, all of these, of course, are copyrighted works. However, one of the statutory licenses that exists in the Copyright Act, where the rate is regulated by statute, is with respect to works that MVPDs retransmit from broadcasters, and that actually goes back to the 1976 Copyright Act. So this regime has existed long before retransmission consent. So for many years, broadcasters and networks didn't earn anything on the retransmission side. Instead, they earned their money from advertising and from this copyright royalty fee that MVPDs pay to the Copyright Office, which then distributes it to the various underlying rights holders. So you have these two different sources of revenue, one of which is fixed as a percentage of cable company subscriber fees, and the other is subject to market forces. What's interesting is that on the outside of this retransmission consent regime, with respect to broadcasting, everything is copyright. So when Comcast pays Viacom to carry Comedy Central, that's paying for our copyright license with no rate regulation. So it's an interesting dynamic where retransmission consent fees essentially work as in economic effects, I think, as a way to augment the statutory license, which it seems is artificially too low.
Well, you only get retransmission fees, compulsory license fees for distant signal importation. The retrans takes care of payment, takes care of the copyright. The compulsory license gives you the right to broadcast, but it doesn't set up a royalty unless it's distant signal importation. Right. I checked that this morning.
True.
You're not double dipping.
But nothing's wrong with that. Okay. Getting back to Justin for a second, and talking about deals. We've read about them in trade magazines and elsewhere. But Justin, if you give us kind of a quick summary of how you characterize some of television broadcast stations' latest efforts to negotiate higher retrans fees, and what about over the top? How are those deals turning out as well? Justin Nielsen.
In most cases, those are two separate deals. So, I mean, you look at it from the over-the-top services that I mentioned. Those are network deals that are negotiated either between the station owner and the network or the affiliate board and the stations. So in some cases, you'll see individual deals like the recent deal that Nexstar signed with Fox for distribution on the over-the-top services, as well as affiliation agreement renewal for their stations in local markets. In other cases, you'll see, from Sinclair and others, their deals with NBC and ABC and CBS, encompass not only the affiliation renewals for the local stations, but also the over-the-top services. Now, when it comes down to negotiations with multi-channel operators like Comcast and others, you see that going directly from the stations and the multi-channel operators that operate in those local markets. So it's two different dynamics, and in most cases, they stagger those arrangements so they know what their kind of revenue streams are going to be in any given time period, because they know on the affiliate side, they are going to be paying some of that compensation back to the networks for programming expense.
To Larry Spywak in Washington, D.C., what is the root of the so-called retransmission consent problem? And once we figure that out, what do we do about it? Larry Spywak.
Well, thank you for asking. I mean, in a paper we wrote a couple of years back called An Economic Framework for Retransmission Consent, it's available on our webpage, we took a look at this. And the problem with retrans, which separates it from the cable model, is that at the root of the problem is that there is the proverbial social contract between broadcasters and the government. The government has set up for many years preferences for the government, for broadcasters, has protected them from competition, certain rules, because it values as a society the things that local broadcasting promotes, localism, so forth and so on. So because of that, that's what makes retrans really at its heart different from the cable model. And as a result, because of localism, you have rules, for example, like the distance signal importation rule that prevents you from taking a signal from, say, I'm in Washington and I have a dispute with my local broadcaster, taking a signal from Baltimore as competitive, trying to get better negotiation because they don't have the localism there. And so it's interesting from an economic standpoint that the broadcaster is a profit maximizer, and they're going to charge what it can. But if we talk about it as a social good, then there's a positive externality there, and quite frankly, the price should be theoretically lower. So that's the problem at the heart. We've done all of these things to protect the social contract that broadcasters have with the American people. We give them the free spectrum. So everything should be viewed through that way. I'm not saying whether it's right. I'm not saying whether it's wrong. I'm just saying that's where we're at as a result of at the root of the problem.
Okay, once we've established that, where do we go from here in terms of realistic, workable, either regulatory or legislative solutions? Let's stay with Larry. What are some thoughts you have for the future? Then I want to get the same question posed to Ryan and Justin. Larry, let's go back to you.
Well, there's a couple things at the FCC. One, perhaps probably the biggest argument is getting the FCC to sunset its distance signal importation rule, which I mentioned a moment ago. The problem with that is that you can, a network can easily get around that by contract with a broadcaster. You can sign a contract and say, thou shalt not sell your signal outside of your designated area. And so the FCC would have to find some legal mechanism, and I don't think they can, to abrogate that contract. There was talk when they had the proceeding open about possibly working on the good faith definition, which is a two-part test. Right. And we still don't know exactly how that is, although Sinclair was fined for, there are rules in the book about essentially colluding with other broadcasters for joint negotiations. That might be one idea. It's still, you get to that problem. There's talk about, interim carriage, but again, given the fact that under the way that the statute is set up, that you may not transmit without the broadcaster's consent, that is the ultimate thing. And again, in a marketplace negotiation, the ability to withhold is key in your bargaining position, which then brings you to the legislative solutions. There have been a variety. There's been a Thune idea, which is sort of a giant sort of a la carte package, best way to describe it. Anna Eshoo proposed a couple years ago to maybe take retrans out of the basic cable tier and instead only have must-carry channels in the basic tier. And then probably Ryan can speak to this the most because he wrote a whole law review note on this, is the de minimis scalise bill, where you would try to essentially turn broadcasters into a cable model. So I'll let Ryan talk about that.
Right, Ryan. Tell us about Next Generation Television Marketplace Act. Ryan Radia.
So this is a piece of legislation that was introduced in two Congresses by Representatives Scalise and Senator DeMint. It didn't end up going particularly far in the legislative process, but the idea was to eliminate the statutory copyright license. As a result, broadcasters and networks would have full copyright ownership of the programming that they create and license. At the same time, the retransmission consent regime would go away. Therefore, if an MVPD wanted to carry the signal of a local broadcast station, it would have to clear copyrights through ordinary negotiation. The outcome would be, in my opinion, a fairly similar model to what we have today in terms of what would be paid to whom, what sort of arrangements would occur between the broadcaster and the network, then the network and the broadcaster and the MVPD. However, you would take the FCC's role out of the process. So we do, of course, have an FCC role today where the agency has the authority to decide what constitutes good faith, as Larry mentioned, and also regulates signal importation. I would be all for taking the FCC role, whether under the copyright regime or under the current regime, out of things like distant signal importation, and instead letting contracts work. If exclusive contracts between broadcasters and networks make sense for both parties, they can maintain them. Otherwise, perhaps an MVPD might be able to import this signal. I don't see there being a particular reason why the FCC needs to be involved in this process. The argument has been made that it's essentially a less expensive dispute resolution mechanism than going to a court and seeking an injunction or damages for breach of contract. But I think that that's sort of the rationale that we should just have expert agencies involved in all sorts of economic disputes, and I don't see why this is unique. One quick point on the social contract side, I think Larry's description of the bargain we made is accurate, but I'm not sure that it leads to the conclusion that we should have lower retransmission fees in the sense that if a broadcaster is charging higher fees rather than lower fees, they're presumably, in many cases, keeping some of that money for themselves, which they use to create local programming. And of course, all of these broadcasters have this spectrum that they're broadcasting on over the air, where everyone who lives within a certain radius and doesn't have obstructions can get for free. So in a sense, the retransmission regime is great for people who have an antenna to get over-the-air television, because they get all the benefits in terms of higher programming costs, higher programming value, including local programming, but they're paying nothing other than the cost of an antenna and a television.
But we subsidize that. That's the point. So if you're going to have a market, then have a market. If not, that's the problem with the social contract, and it's there. And it's, like I said, if you take it from a social value, it's that positive externality. I'm not advocating rate regulation by any such means, but if we have to make a decision as as this market moves. You're already starting to see network programmers do their own individual. CBS.com is a great example. They're actually having individual programming where you're getting an over-the-top model. And so the broadcasters, I think, are searching for whatever that model is. The fact that we had the incentive auction where even though the broadcasters didn't pay for the spectrum, we gave them a piece of the revenues ostensibly to move. It is a changing business. I don't envy the position that they're in. It's very difficult. They're losing advertising revenue because of the competition in the market. It's a tough position to be in. But I think the country has to make a decision about what they want from that social contract. Is localism really such an important thing that we have to get involved? Tom Wheeler did a lot of work with that, and they have these localism reports, and then you start getting into journalism, which is sort of off-base. But therein lies the central question of the debate that you just can't get around. It would be great if we moved all market, and I think most people in the industry would be happy with that, get rid of the compulsory license and all form of regulation. But you can't be sort of half pregnant and split the baby is the problem, which I think where we're at now. Because I don't think, in the absence of that, even in a free market, you would see that much of a reduction in retrans fees once you got to that clean market, because the cost of programming is the cost of programming, and people are entitled to recover their costs. So
I agree.
But what politicians don't like are holdups. And that's the problem and blackout, which brings you back to the story again.
We've had a robust counterpoint in Washington, D.C. Justin Nielsen, you've been observing this commentary back and forth about what is the perceived problem, what might be the possible solutions on the legislative and regulatory fronts. What are your thoughts, Justin Nielsen?
Well, I would say from the TV station owner's perspective, they are definitely wanting more of a free market approach. They feel like the industry itself is highly regulated. And they're pushing the current FCC into deregulatory moves on the local and national level in terms of ownership caps. So they do feel like they are in a different box than the cable networks, and they still think that the value of their programming is not being monetarily received from some of the multi-channel operators, and that's why they're increasing rates. Based on our analysis here and in the slide deck, you can see the discrepancy between what the pay TV market is paying to cable networks and regional sports networks as compared to the broadcast stations. And there's still a wide disparity in terms of the audience they deliver and the actual monetary value that they're receiving for that programming from multi-channel operators. Now the economics are changing, and as you see, and you probably see in the trade press as well as in the major news media, that the cable business is on the decline, and you see actually more and more consumers cutting the cord or not signing up for programming through a traditional cable or satellite service and going over the top. And we've actually done some consumer surveys, and in that slide deck on page 8, we did a consumer survey based on those cord cutters and cord nevers and how they're receiving TV. And in a lot of cases, they're receiving TV or online video through the Netflixes, the Slings, and others, as well as using over-the-air antennas for the broadcast programming. So the marketplace is already kind of shifting towards a lower cost model in some instances, or an a la carte model, where traditional cable packages are just getting larger and larger and more expensive. And one of the biggest reasons that people are cutting the cord or not signing up for that type of service is because of the cost.
As Justin mentioned, and as you've seen on the screen periodically thus far in our webinar, we are showing you various charts, graphs, explanations produced by Justin Nielsen. This entire document is placed on the DPI website, and you can review it in real time or at your leisure. Let's look toward the future. Now, admittedly, we have an FCC that's not quite up to full strength, hasn't really developed much of a track record. Things in Congress are pretty much at loggerheads right now. It seems that hardly anything seems to get passed of any substance. But let's do a little predictive stuff. Say it's 3 years from now. I'd like you to give me your prognostications. Where will things be on retransmission consent on the regulatory side and on the legislative side? Who's going to take the lead? And what will that new structure look like? Let's first start with Larry Spywak in Washington. Larry.
Well, it's not going to be 3 years. It's actually going to be 2 years. In
That's right.
2019.
The next flight.
The Satellite Act, whatever the current name, Stellar, I think it is now, is up. So this is must-pass legislation. Otherwise, the DBS industry goes dark. So there will be something. So the question is whether or not they pass a clean bill, or whether or not they decide to make some adjustments to the retrans regime. And I think once we get done with the net neutrality fight this year, I think that will be a large focus of certainly the telecom argument starting next year. We'll see what happens.
Yeah. Ryan.
But it will come to the forefront because it's a must pass. If they don't do that, 2 DBS providers go dark.
No, that train will leave the station. You're exactly right.
Yes.
Ryan Rodio.
I agree that the must-pass 2019 legislation is going to be the next time we likely see any meaningful action, or at least serious discussion of it. The Stellar bill, I believe, had a couple of clauses dealing with JSAs, but it didn't meaningfully change the overall retransmission regime. My guess is that may will happen again because of the various sides not being able to agree. I think anything particularly bold is not all that likely to occur, although even though I would prefer something bolder. Over at the FCC, based on Chairman Pai's general approach to broadcasting, I don't see the commission taking an approach to, for example, addressing the good faith issue in a way that's designed to reduce blackouts through whether it's interim carriage or other matters. It doesn't seem to me that he's likely to go in a direction that makes it harder for broadcasters to try to negotiate and bargain aggressively with MVPDs.
Yeah, and just to jump in on that, I mean, right now the FCC has to deal with, I think, a very neglected area, which is the repacking of the broadcast auction. To be blunt, they really didn't. They kind of kicked the can way far down the road, and now that is due right now. And I think I think they've got to throw the broadcasters a legitimate bone on this because
Right. And is there enough?
The way they set up was like 39 months just because their computer spit it out, and I don't think it's enough. And just in Chairman Pai's testimony at his confirmation hearing, he said, I think the amount of money that we set aside for repacking is insufficient. So I think you've got to, like I said, you've got to get the broadcasters whole and get them together before he's going to start taking on anything else. That's a factor to put in there.
That's exactly right. And post-auction repacking is one of the topics we'll probably be addressing later this year on one of our DPI webinars, as well as, of course, net neutrality. I want to go now to Justin Nielsen for his thoughts on future predictions. Justin.
Yeah, I mean, you can see from our projections in the slide deck on page 3, we do see that the retrans revenue continues to climb over the next 3 to 5 years. But we do see a stabilization or kind of a leveling off in terms of the growth rates. I mean, it's been a double-digit increase every year for the past 10 years, and we do see that kind of leveling out with the next few periods. So you see that retrans consent elections will be coming up at later this year, as well as some of the major group owners that will be coming up through renewal periods in 2018. So 2018 is definitely a big period for them. If the Sinclair and Tribune deal does go through, you'll see some step-ups in those rates because Tribune, historically has had lower rates just because they have a lot of, CW stations and now with some of the Fox stations, Sinclair will be one of the largest Fox affiliate owners in the country if that deal goes through. So you will see some market dynamics happening, as well as if the FCC does do some deregulatory moves in terms of local and national ownership caps, you'll see a little bit more growth in that area just because of the scale that the broadcasters will have. Now, I mean, on the repack, that is a big disruption for the industry, obviously. And although you'll see some new technology coming out, hopefully, I mean, Nexstar and Sinclair have been pushing forward for the new broadcasting standard, ATSC 3.0. So that will enable them in some markets, and I think they're initially launching in 97 markets, the ability to offer some advanced services and programming that they weren't able to do under the old standard.
Well, we sure covered a lot of territory so far in our webinar, but I'd like to throw it back to Washington for any parting commentary on the issues at hand, and then we'll go back to Monterey. But Washington first. Ryan and Larry, any parting thoughts?
Well, when we discuss all of these programming arrangements with distributors, a point that Larry made early on is that the original regime was the original reality, that is, was one cable company in each market and one broadcaster for each network. And it was essentially a bilateral arrangement, and we now have 2 to 3 MVPDs, or 3 to 4, depending on what you consider DirecTV as. But one interesting point about this change is that it's not particularly unique to this industry in the sense that every package of copyrighted works, whether it's a movie portfolio or a set of sports teams like the NFL, you have one owner and lots of distributors. And the way that we've decided to assign intellectual property ownership in this country is that every copyright owner has a monopoly over their own copyrighted works. And a lot of people would object to the use of the term monopoly there. But this is just sort of another example of that situation, albeit with the extreme additional complexity of retransmission consent and FCC regulation.
Larry.
Well, I mean, I think as you've heard by this conversation, the retransmission regime is, to put it politely, dysfunctional. It started off as an interesting idea. Originally, most, as you pointed out earlier, most people took it under must carry because it was designed to make sure that broadcast signals were carried. But through the growth of multiple distribution platforms, through the change of the market, it's just a hot mess at this point. And I think, a holistic approach, try and figure out, what exactly that we want out of this, because you will have effects. If you end up reducing retransmission fees, there are people like Amazon and Twitter and who are more than willing to buy, for example, the NFL package. And, when I got started in this business years ago, there was this great fear. I mean, that's what overrode the 92 Cable Act, the veto. Al Gore was able to do that because he stood up and said, if we don't pass this legislation, the Super Bowl is going to move to pay TV. And so these are all, and I think we need to think fundamentally about the role still of what do we want from our local broadcasters? Do we want localism? Do we not? I mean, where is the market sort of evolving here? And I don't think there's any easy solutions to this problem.
Yeah. Thank you, Washington, D.C. Justin Nielsen in California. Some parting thoughts.
Yeah, I would just say that the market economics are evolving, and I mean, who's to say what's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 years in terms of the trends towards cord cutting and over the top services. So you may see an entirely different TV station marketplace in the 2 to 3 years, and I think looking at it from a regulatory perspective, I mean the free market has worked so far. And yes, there have been disruptions, but in most cases, those disruptions have been short in time period, and there has been some resolution. So I would say, try not to step too far, into a regulatory move, especially, from the TV station's perspective. They're going through a lot of disruption right now.
Well, very good. Thank you. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Justin Nielsen, Ryan Radia, and Larry Spywak, and thanks to all of you today for watching as we looked at the present and the future of retransmission consent. Please visit digitalpolicyinstitute.org to see full biographies of our terrific panel, the PowerPoint presentation produced by Justin Nielsen, and also to learn more about our institute and the communications topics we're following. Today's webinar and all past DPI webinars are and always will be archived on our DPI site. For the Digital Policy Institute, I'm Barry Umansky. See you next time.